My stepfather snatched my phone. Mid-call to teach me respect. The voice on the other end taught him something instead. His hand closed around my phone before I even registered he'd stood up. 1 second, I was walking toward the hallway, phone pressed to my ear. Senator Holloway's voice tight with urgency in my ear. The next, Martin Pierce, 6 feet of car dealership confidence and 12 years of practiced condescension, had yanked it clean out of my grip and lifted it above his shoulder like I was a child reaching for something I hadn't earned. The entire private dining room went silent. Not the polite silence of people who didn't notice. The sharp, collective silence of 8 people who noticed everything and were deciding in real time whether to pretend they hadn't. "Martin," I said, very quietly, "give it back." He smiled the way he always smiled when he had the room. "No, I'm going to teach you some respect." Then he pressed my work phone to his ear and said to whoever was on the line in the loud, unhurried voice of a man who has never once considered that he might be wrong about the size of the room he's standing in, "Whoever this is, she's at a family dinner." What followed was a pause. Not a confused pause, not an apologetic pause, a pause of the specific temperature that comes just before something irreversible. Then, through my phone, held in my stepfather's hand, came a voice that had testified before the Senate Armed Services Committee 14 times, that had appeared on the front page of the Washington Post 3 times in the past calendar year, that belonged to a man whose staff operated under federal security clearance, and whose direct calls I had been taking after hours for 2.5 years. "This is Senator William Holloway," the voice said, measured, cold, precise. "Why are you answering her work phone?" The color left Martin's face the way heat leaves a room when you open a window in January. Fast, completely, all at once. His mouth opened, nothing came out, and for the first time in 12 years, the first time since he walked into my mother's house and decided, on the basis of nothing I had ever done, that I was someone who needed to be managed, Martin Pierce had absolutely nothing to say. Part 1. The 16-year-old. He never updated. My name is Megan Turner. I am 31 years old. I am a senior national security policy advisor on the staff of Senator William Holloway, Democrat of Virginia, member of the Senate Intelligence Committee and the Armed Services Committee, a man who has been in public service for 22 years and who, in the 2.5 years I have worked directly for him, has never once called my personal cell after 7 p.m., unless something needed to be fixed before midnight. I want to say that up front, because what Martin never understood, what he had decided on some permanent and immovable level that he would never need to understand, was that importance does not announce itself at dinner parties. It doesn't wear the right watch or dominate the conversation or own 4 car dealerships in the Richmond metro area. Sometimes it looks like a woman in her late 20s, quiet at the edge of a table, whose phone buzzing at 7:42 p.m. on a Tuesday means a funding clause affecting overseas federal employees is about to be voted on incorrectly, and she is the person whose job it is to stop that from happening. Martin had decided what I was when I was 16. Anxious, bookish. My mother's quiet daughter from her first marriage, who jumped at loud voices and spent too much time alone and clearly needed someone to explain how the real world worked. He had not updated that file in 12 years. My mother, Diane Turner Pierce, met Martin at a charity golf tournament when I was 15. She was 42, newly divorced, and, I think, genuinely exhausted from the specific kind of exhaustion that comes from being the only adult in the house for 3 years. Martin was attentive in the beginning, the way certain men are attentive in the beginning, when there is still something to win. He brought her flowers. He was patient with me, in the distant, slightly performative way of a man who wants credit for tolerating someone else's child. I remember the first time he interrupted me at dinner. I was talking about a history paper I'd written, something about Cold War intelligence failures, and he cut in to tell a story about a car deal he'd closed that week. My mother laughed. I stopped talking. He never noticed I'd stopped. I filed that. I file things. I was on a full academic scholarship to the University of Virginia by 17. Martin told my mother I'd gotten lucky. I graduated with honors in political science and international relations. He told relatives I was book smart but not street smart, which is a phrase people use when they want to diminish something they don't understand. I got my first position on Capitol Hill at 23, working as a legislative assistant for a congressman from Virginia's 5th District. Martin said in front of my Uncle Ray at Thanksgiving that I should try not to become someone's coffee girl forever. I became a senior national security advisor at 29. He was still calling it answering emails for politicians as recently as last Christmas. Part 2. The dinner. My mother's birthday falls in March. She turned 58 this year and had wanted, specifically, a family dinner at a private room at Pico La Roma in Richmond, a restaurant she'd loved for decades, with red leather booths and low lighting and a menu that hadn't changed significantly since 1987, which was the point. Familiar, safe, hers. I drove down from Washington on a Saturday afternoon, 4 hours on I-95 with a travel mug of coffee and a briefing document on my passenger seat that I was not technically supposed to have outside a secure facility facility, but had been cleared to review off-site for the weekend, given the pending committee timeline. The amendment had been through 3 drafts. There was a 4th coming. I'd been told by the senator's chief of staff, a woman named Patricia Okafor, 15 years on the Hill, 8 of them with Holloway, that we might have a problem with how the funding language had been revised in committee, and that if the language went to a vote as currently written, it would create a gap in the security upgrade program for State Department personnel at 3 overseas postings. Not front-page news, never front-page news, but the kind of quiet, specific, consequential work that existed in the gap between what the public understood about government and what actually kept things running. I arrived at my mother's house at 4. Martin was in the driveway washing his Cadillac Escalade, a car he washed personally, by hand, every weekend, which I had once made the mistake of finding mildly endearing. He looked up when I pulled in. "Megan," he said, "you look tired." That was his greeting. 12 years of history compressed into 4 words designed to make me feel slightly less than I'd felt when I got out of the car. "Martin," I said, "nice weather." He turned back to the car. Inside, my mother was getting ready and already apologizing for being behind schedule. Chloe, Martin's daughter from his first marriage, 27, a dental hygienist in Richmond who I had always liked despite everything, because none of this was her fault, was in the kitchen opening a bottle of wine. My Uncle Ray, my mother's brother, was sitting in the living room watching basketball with the comfortable silence of a man who has been in this house enough times to know where everything is. My cousins, Joel and Tracy, arrived at 6. Martin came in from the driveway at 6:15, changed into a blazer without being asked, and immediately began telling Joel about a new Ram 1500 model he was getting on the lot next month, because Martin's conversational repertoire was a very small wheel that rotated between cars, sports, and anecdotes that positioned him as the smartest person in whichever situation he was describing. We left for the restaurant at 7. My phone buzzed at 7:38 when we were parking. A secure notification from Patricia Okafor's office line: committee vote moved to Monday. Senator wants to connect tonight if possible. My stomach did the thing it does. Not quite dropping, more like sharpening. The feeling of a gear shifting. I texted back, available after dinner, approximately 9 p.m. Her reply came before I got out of the car. May need earlier. Senator has a conflict at 9. Will advise. I pocketed my phone and walked into the restaurant. Part 3. Escalation. The private room at Piccola Roma held 12, and we filled 8 seats around the far end of the table. Bread appeared immediately. Martin ordered a bottle of wine by pointing at something mid-priced on the list, which he would later describe to someone as an excellent Barolo, because the label was in Italian, and he was confident none of us would check. The first 40 minutes were fine, in the negotiated, slightly effortful way that family dinners are fine when everyone at the table is operating under an implicit agreement not to disturb the surface. My mother talked about a renovation she was considering for the sunroom. Uncle Ray talked about his youngest starting middle school. Chloe talked about a vacation she was planning to Costa Rica, and Martin interrupted twice to suggest destinations she hadn't asked for input on, and Chloe smiled and nodded, and I watched her do it with the particular recognition of someone who has spent years learning the same skill. My phone buzzed at 7:51. I glanced at it under the table. Patricia, Senator wants to connect at 8:15 if you can manage it. Draft 4 just landed. There's a problem. I looked at the bread basket. I looked at my mother, who was mid-sentence about tile samples. I thought about the 3 State Department employees at overseas postings who were not at this table and did not know that the funding clause governing their facility security upgrade was currently in the wrong form. I would be 2 minutes. 4 at most. I set my napkin beside my plate and stood quietly. I need to take a call. I'll be right back. Martin looked up from his wine. At your mother's birthday dinner? 2 minutes, I said. He laughed. Not to me, to the table. The kind of laugh that makes you a prop in someone else's performance. You think you're so important that you can't sit through one dinner? My mother said quietly. Megan, just sit down. My phone buzzed again. Not a text. A call. The screen read, Senator Holloway. Direct line, personal cell. After hours. I answered. Megan Turner. Part 4. What happened next? I have described what happened next. I want to describe it again, more slowly, because the thing that stays with me is not the moment Martin's face went white, though I won't pretend that wasn't something, but the 3 seconds before it. The 3 seconds when he was still holding my phone, when he still had the posture and expression of a man who was entirely, comfortably in control of the room. He'd lifted it above his shoulder. His chin was up. Half the table was watching him with the specific attention of people who recognize a performance and are still deciding whether to applaud or look away. And then he put it to his ear and said his line. And Senator William Holloway, 22 years in the United States Senate, member of 2 committees that received classified briefings on a weekly basis, a man whose voice had been in rooms that would never appear in any public record, said with absolute unhurried precision, "This is Senator William Holloway. Why are you answering her work phone? I want to be honest about what I felt in that moment. Not triumph, not satisfaction, not the clean, cinematic emotion of a scene resolving the way scenes resolve in movies. I felt tired. I felt the tiredness of someone who has spent 12 years being underestimated by a man who was never going to update his understanding of who she was, and who had just, in a restaurant, on her mother's birthday, in front of her family, demonstrated the full depth of that failure in front of witnesses. I stepped forward and took my phone back. His hand released it without resistance. "Senator, I apologize," I said. "I'm available." And then I walked toward the door and did my job. Part 5. The parking lot. My Honda Civic was in the lot across the street. I got in, turned the heat on, balanced my work laptop across my knees, and pulled up my secure inbox. Draft 4 of the amendment language was 43 pages. The problem was in Section 7B, subsection DAO, in a funding carryover clause that had been modified by a junior staffer in committee in a way that wasn't malicious, just wrong. A timing provision that, as written, would require facilities to demonstrate expenditure compliance within a fiscal quarter that didn't align with the procurement cycle for the security hardware they were supposed to be purchasing. The result, funding couldn't be accessed on the timeline the program required. 3 facilities would be delayed. The delay had security implications that I was not going to describe in a parking lot narrative, but that Patricia Okafor had described to me as the kind of thing that seems administrative until something goes wrong. I rewrote the subsection in 22 minutes. My hands were still faintly unsteady when I typed, the specific tremor of adrenaline that hadn't found anywhere to go. But my brain was working at the other register, the one that didn't run on adrenaline, the one that ran on 12 years of training and a detailed working knowledge of federal procurement law, and a forensic attention to language that I had been developing since I was 16 years old, writing history papers about Cold War intelligence failures at a desk in a quiet room while the man downstairs watched football. At 8:47 p.m., Senator Holloway called. "We used your recommendation," he said. "The committee will see the revised language before Monday's vote." "Good," I said. A brief silence. "Megan." He had a way of saying a name that meant I'm about to say something I don't say easily. Nobody doing this job should have to prove it at a dinner table. I closed my eyes for a moment. "I know," I said. Then I closed my laptop, took one breath that lasted slightly longer than normal, and walked back across the street to my mother's birthday dinner. Part 6. What the room looked like. When I returned, dessert was untouched. The tiramisu was sitting in the center of the table in the specific accusatory way of food that has been ready for a while and nobody has reached for. The atmosphere had the quality of a room after a window has blown open. Everything slightly displaced, everyone slightly uncertain of what position they'd been in before. Martin was staring into his coffee cup, not performing, just staring. Chloe looked up when I walked in and held my gaze for a second, with an expression I didn't quite know how to read, except that it wasn't the expression she'd had before I left. Something had moved behind her eyes. My Uncle Ray gave me a single small nod from the end of the table, the nod of a man who had watched something happen and had decided where he stood on it. My mother appeared from the hallway almost immediately, as though she'd been waiting. "Megan," she said quietly, "I'm sorry he embarrassed you." I stopped walking. Embarrassed. I turned the word over. I thought about how much work it did, how neatly it shifted the center of gravity away from what had actually happened and toward my feelings about what had happened. Martin had grabbed a work phone during a national security call. The problem, in my mother's framing, was that I'd been embarrassed. "That's not enough," I said. Her eyes filled, the way they filled whenever we arrived at the edge of the conversation she didn't want to have. "What do you want me to say?" "The truth," I said. "That you watched him take my phone out of my hand and told me to sit down. That you have been telling me to sit down since I was 16. That it was easier to manage my reactions than his behavior, because managing his behavior had consequences, and managing mine didn't." The hallway was very quiet. She didn't deny it. That was the thing about my mother that I had never quite found a way to describe to anyone who hadn't watched it happen in real time. She wasn't cruel. She wasn't indifferent. She loved me, genuinely, in the complicated, imperfect way of someone who had made a decision and then spent years finding ways to make the decision livable. She had chosen Martin, and having chosen him, she had spent 12 years performing the small daily work of protecting that choice, smoothing, deflecting, reframing, asking me to let it go. I had let a great many things go. I was done with that particular practice. Behind her, Martin stepped into the hallway. He'd lost the blazer. Without it, he looked smaller. Just a 55-year-old man in a dress shirt, holding a glass of water, wearing an expression I had genuinely never seen on his face before. Not anger, not the practiced dismissiveness he reached for when he wanted to end a conversation. Something that looked like the very early stages of understanding. "I didn't know it was a senator," he said. I looked at him for a long moment. "I know you didn't," I said. "That's the problem. You think the person on the phone determines whether I deserve basic respect?" He looked away. "You've been deciding what I am since I was 16, I said. "You decided I was someone you didn't need to pay attention to, and every time I did something something that contradicted that decision, you found a way to refile it. Scholarship, luck, Capitol Hill job, coffee girl, senior advisor, emails for politicians. The file you made of me in 2010 has never been updated, Martin. And you grabbed my phone tonight because you were still living inside it. The hallway was so quiet I could hear the restaurant behind us. I don't know what to say, he said. I know, I said. You can think about it. Then I walked past both of them, back into the dining room, sat down, and ate the tiramisu, which was, in fact, excellent. Part 7. The aftermath. I drove back to Washington the next morning. The Sunday was normal. I worked. I ran 3 miles on the trail near my apartment. I called my college roommate and told her the story, and she said, "Megan, you absolute legend," which was generous but appreciated. The professional consequences of the previous evening were zero. Senator Holloway was, the following Tuesday, warm and efficient as always. Patricia Okafor sent me a note, 1 sentence, Patricia style, that read, "Amendment passed committee, Monday, language intact. Good work." The 3 overseas facilities received their funding on schedule. Nobody at those postings knew there had been a problem. Nobody at the Capitol knew about a dinner in Richmond. That is generally how this kind of work goes. 2 weeks after the birthday dinner, my mother called. "I started therapy," she said. She said it in the particular way of someone who has made a decision that costs them something and wants you to know it cost them something without fully explaining why. "I'm glad," I said. "It was your Uncle Ray's suggestion." A pause. "Martin and I have been talking." Okay, another pause. Longer. "He asked me what you actually do," she said. I realized I couldn't answer him fully. "I know you work for a senator. I know you do policy." But I realized I didn't know the specifics because I'd never asked. Something moved in my chest. Not forgiveness. That was a different conversation, on a different timeline that I hadn't decided to have yet, but something adjacent to it. Something like the very beginning of a door. "You can ask," I said. "Will you tell me?" "Yes." Martin sent a text 3 days after that. "I handled that badly. I should have given you the phone back immediately, and I should not have made a joke about your work. I'm sorry. I read it 4 times. It was a real apology." Not the full accounting. Not the 12 years of casual diminishment, the coffee girl comment, the book smart but not street smart, the way he'd laughed at my scholarship like I'd won a raffle rather than earned something. That accounting would take longer, and I was not sure he was ready for it, and I was not sure I was ready to give it, but it was a real apology. I saved it. I file things. I didn't respond. Not because I wanted revenge, not because I wanted him to suffer, but because I had spent 12 years responding immediately, smoothing immediately, accommodating immediately, letting it go immediately, and I had decided, sitting in a parking lot in Richmond with a laptop across my knees and a funding clause that needed to be fixed, that immediately was no longer a pace I was setting for anyone else's comfort. He would hear from me when I was ready, not before. Epilogue. 8 months later, I went home for Thanksgiving. It was the first family gathering since March. My mother had been in therapy for 8 months. Martin had done what I would describe as the minimum necessary work. A few more texts over the summer, a phone call in October in which he asked about my job and listened, actually listened, without once comparing it to anything he owned or had closed or had decided was more important. I would not say it was repaired. I would say it was in process. Those are different things, and I have stopped pretending they're the same in order to make holiday dinners feel warmer than they are. At Thanksgiving, my phone buzzed during dinner. Patricia Okafor. Quick heads up. Briefing doc for the Tuesday markup is in your secure inbox. No action needed tonight. I looked up from my plate. Martin was watching me. "Work?" he said. "Yes." He nodded. "Anything serious?" "Just a heads up," I said. "Nothing that needs tonight." He nodded again and went back to his food. I went back to mine. It was not a dramatic moment. There was no music, no resolution, no clean exchange that wrapped 12 years of something complicated into a satisfying shape. It was just a man who used to grab my phone asking a question in a normal tone of voice, and me answering it like a person who didn't need to defend herself anymore. It was quiet. It was mine. I am 31 years old. I have been the person in the room that certain people decided not to pay attention to since I was 16. And the work I did in that time, the scholarships, the degrees, the positions, the 14-hour days in offices, and the nights in parking lots rewriting amendment language before midnight votes, none of that was performed for Martin Pierce's eventual approval. But I will not pretend it didn't feel like something. The night he finally stopped talking long enough to hear who was on the phone. Some lessons land softly, some need a senator.